She was 21 and homeless. No apartment, no family willing to answer, no savings, just a canvas satchel and $5 she had hidden inside the hem of an old winter coat. And with that $5, she bought a forgotten wooden barometer case carver's shop outside Boston in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, absent from county trade maps since 1947. Half the north roof had folded inward. The brick chimney leaned 6 inches toward the yard. The county condemned it on October 14, 2022, with demolition scheduled for the following spring. Yet behind a warped, beveling rack waited a sealed recess untouched for generations, holding an oversized shaving tool whose hollow ebony handle had not been opened in decades. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sylvie Mercer had been measuring escape routes her whole life without knowing it. She grew up in rented rooms north of Boston where the furniture never quite belonged to anyone and every move began with grocery boxes saved under a bed. Her mother, Lenora, worked alternating shifts in hospital laundry rooms and hotel kitchens, keeping receipts in envelopes and silence around anything that hurt. Sylvie learned early that possessions mattered less than whether they could be carried down 3 flights of stairs before dawn. Her father disappeared when she was 9, leaving 1 shaving mug, 2 work shirts, and a forwarding address that stopped working before Christmas. Lenora never cursed him. She simply washed the mug, wrapped it in newspaper, and kept using 1 chair at the kitchen table as though absence were another household object requiring dusting. The steadier figure was Lenora's father, Jonah Mercer, who lived in a narrow, clapboard house in Waltham and repaired antique weather instruments for collectors who still trusted mercury brass and seasoned timber. Every second Saturday, Sylvie rode 2 buses to his shed behind the house. Jonah never gave her the delicate instruments first. He set a broom in her hands and made her sweep walnut curls away from the bench, sort broken moldings by grain, and carry warped scraps to a barrel beside the stove. Later, he let her flatten salvaged walnut with a small block plane, then showed her how a barometer case had to allow glass and metal to move differently when a room warmed. He would press his thumbnail against the end grain, listening more than looking, and ask her whether the board wanted to become a frame or firewood. By 16, she could identify black walnut by smell after 1 clean shaving and could cut a shallow housing without bruising the edge. Jonah's sentence for difficult wood stayed with her longer than any lesson. Never force a board that is telling the truth. He meant grain direction. But Sylvie eventually understood that resistance could be information. He died during a February thaw when she was 17. By the time Sylvie and Lenora reached his house, distant relatives had already cleared most of the shed. The small planes carving gouges, brass dividers, patterned books, and the ebony-handled beveling shave. Jonah, guarded above his bench, were gone. Sylvie was given his wool cap because no one else wanted it. She wore it home beneath freezing rain. 3 years later, she met Daniel Kress. How was courteous in public and exacting in private, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he had discovered that disappointment could control a room more efficiently. He checked grocery receipts, questioned every bus fare, corrected which friends were good for her, and gradually made their shared bank account the center of every decision. When Sylvie found irregular withdrawals, he called them temporary loans. When she asked about the gambling websites open on his laptop, he closed the screen and spoke for nearly an hour about loyalty. By then, most of her paycheck entered an account whose password he had changed twice. On March 3, 2023, she learned the balance was $11.42. Daniel had left before sunrise. Sylvie packed 1 shirt, 2 pairs of socks, Jonah's wool cap, and the canvas satchel she had owned since high school. At the bottom of the closet, she found an envelope where she had once hidden emergency cash. It was empty except for a $5 bill that had slipped behind the cardboard backing. She took a commuter bus to Lenora's building. Her mother opened the door but did not remove the chain. Sylvie could smell onions browning somewhere behind her. On a shelf by the entrance stood Jonah's shaving mug, still wrapped at the base with the same yellowing newspaper from 12 years earlier. "I need somewhere to sleep for tonight." Lenora's eyes lowered to the satchel. "You mud your choice. Now live with it." 8 words. Sylvie waited for the chain to move. It did not. Her mother touched 2 fingers to the metal as though she might lift it, then let her hand fall. That small, unfinished gesture hurt more than the closed door. Sylvie put Jonah's cap on before reaching the sidewalk because the wind had turned sharp and because she needed both hands free to carry what remained. For 6 weeks she moved wherever a locked door would not force her onward. In Cambridge, she slept upright twice in the last row of an all-night bus, waking whenever the driver reached the terminus. In Somerville, she spent 3 nights beneath the covered loading platform of a closed furniture warehouse until a security guard quietly told her which church vestibule stayed unlocked until 5. She washed in library restrooms and used paper towels to dry her hair. The $5 bill remained untouched while loose change paid for crackers, 1 bruised apple, and a cup of coffee divided across an entire afternoon. By the 2nd week, she had $3.86 in coins apart from the bill. By the 4th, $1.11. She walked farther to avoid fares, sometimes following the Charles, until her heels burned through her socks. A woman at a bakery in Watertown slipped yesterday's roll into a paper sleeve without asking for payment. An elderly custodian at a municipal building once left a folding chair near a radiator and then deliberately looked the other direction. Sylvie accepted those mercies carefully. She had learned that dependence could become a door someone else locked. On April 17, rain settled over Boston before daylight. Sylvie entered the main reading room of a public library to warm her hands and search the employment classifieds. She read janitorial listings, kitchen work, warehouse shifts, and one advertisement printed so badly the final line tilted downward. County, disposition, structure, and lot. Former Mercer Weather Case Works. Uninhabitable, as is. Cash conveyance, $5. She read the name again. Mercer. Below, it was a parcel number, a Middlesex County contact, and a warning that the structure carried demolition liability. Someone had penciled beside the clipping in faint gray lead no bidders. Sylvie copied the number onto the back of a discarded checkout slip and used the library telephone. The clerk confirmed the price. $5. Not $500, not a deposit. 5. Sylvie opened the hidden seam in her winter coat and pulled out the bill she had refused to spend through rain hunger and 6 weeks of uncertain nights. The paper was softened at the corners now, but Jonah's old rule came back with peculiar clarity: first determine what the material is telling you. At noon, she folded the classified advertisement into her satchel and walked toward South Station to find out how close $5 could bring her to a ruined shop carrying her own surname. What waited at the end of that road had already survived 76 years without her. The cheapest bus carried Sylvie northwest through morning traffic past wet brick suburbs and low industrial yards where rain silvered the roofs of machine shops. Her remaining coins bought the ticket only as far as Concord, so she walked the rest. The parcel map in her satchel showed nearly 11 miles between the bus stop and the property, most of it along old county roads that narrowed between stone walls. Near dusk, she found an open-sided hay barn behind a fallow field and slept between 2 square bales with Jonah's cap beneath her cheek. The temperature fell to 34 degrees. Each time she woke, she could hear mice moving inside the hay and rain ticking against the corrugated roof. At first light, she continued west. The town appeared gradually rather than all at once, a white church steeple above bare maples. Then Harrow's Hardware with green-painted trim, Doris Bell's Corner Cafe beside a laundromat, Pike & Sons Feed in a converted carriage house, Merritt Pharmacy with 2 faded awnings, and Colby's Auto Repair behind a yard of stacked tires. Nothing in the street suggested a place waiting to be discovered. A delivery van idled outside the cafe. 2 men drank coffee near the pharmacy window. Someone swept yesterday's leaves from the courthouse steps. The county clerk's office occupied the first floor of a granite municipal building whose radiators clicked loudly enough to be heard from the corridor. Sylvie entered at 8:43. Behind the counter sat a narrow woman with white hair gathered into a braid no thicker than a pencil. She wore a magnifying lens on a black cord around her neck and kept one finger against the line of whatever document she was reading. The brass nameplate said MRS, Eleanor Vale Property Clerk. Sylvie placed the advertisement on the counter. Mrs. Vale read it, then looked at Sylvie's coat, canvas bag, wet shoes, and finally her face. "You came about Mercer Weather Case Works." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk opened a gray folder. You understand the structure has no electrical service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the well has not been certified potable. Yes, ma'am. You understand the north roof is structurally compromised. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county may require demolition if you fail to stabilize it before the next inspection. Sylvie looked through the window toward the courthouse flag stirring in cold rain. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Vale removed her glasses. That last one is the part people usually reconsider. I have $5. The clerk regarded her for several seconds, then closed the folder. That is exactly what the county is asking. The deed was 3 pages long. Sylvie read every line because Jonah had taught her never to sign near a measurement she had not checked. The parcel contained just under an acre, an abandoned workshop, a stone cellar, a shallow well, and a narrow access strip from Old Sudbury Road. Taxes had been waived during municipal disposition. Existing defects transferred entirely to the buyer. Mrs. Vale pointed to 3 initials and 1 signature line. Sylvie signed. The clerk took the $5 bill and carried it to a walnut desk at the rear of the room. She slid the deed beneath a heavy brass embossing stamp, leaned with both hands, and brought the county seal down with a soft, mechanical thump. There. The word sounded disproportionately permanent. Mrs. Vale returned the deed, then gave directions without looking at a map. Old Sudbury Road west for 2.3 miles. Turn at the stone culvert after the abandoned schoolhouse. The lane is barely visible. If you reach the reservoir gate, you have gone too far. Sylvie folded the deed carefully. Mrs. Vale did not release her end. Mercer. Sylvie looked up. The clerk's attention had shifted to the signature. Your grandfather was Jonah Mercer. Sylvie's fingers tightened around the paper. Yes. Mrs. Vale sat back. For the first time, the efficient stillness left her face. I used to come here. Sylvie said nothing. Not often. Maybe twice a year. Always with rolled drawings under his arm. Mrs. Vale glanced toward a bank of old map cabinets. He spent hours copying parcel records by hand. Never requested certified copies. Said the originals told him more. That sounds like him. He asked about that workshop repeatedly. Sylvie looked at the deed. Did he own it? No. Not according to any record I ever saw. Mrs. Vale rose and crossed to the oldest filing cabinet. She opened a drawer, searched behind a row of index cards, and returned carrying 1 card discolored at the edges. Mercer Weather Case Works. Owner of record 1888, Elias Mercer. Trade closed 1947. Beneath the typed lines was a later pencil notation. Inquiry Jonah Mercer, 1998. Inquiry Jonah Mercer, 2004. Inquiry Jonah Mercer, 2011. Sylvie read the 3 dates. Why would he keep asking? Mrs. Vale shook her head. He never told me. The clerk finally released the deed. But the first time he came, he stood exactly where you are standing. Outside the rain had weakened to mist. Sylvie followed Old Sudbury Road beyond the last storefronts past a cemetery wall and fields still brown from winter. After 2 miles, walnut trees began appearing along the roadside, their black limbs twisted against the pale sky. At the stone culvert, she found the old lane half hidden beneath leaves. A man repairing wire fencing on the neighboring parcel straightened when she passed. He was perhaps 70, with 1 red suspender hanging loose beside his coat. A black and white dog watched from beside his boots without barking. You headed to the Mercer place. Sylvie stopped. I think so. The man considered that answer. Then you are on the right road. The dog came forward, sniffed Sylvie's hand, and returned to the fence. No questions followed. The lane bent through 12 walnut trees and ended before a long, low building set slightly downhill from the road. Sylvie stopped walking. The shop was larger than she had imagined from the county description, perhaps 38 feet long and 24 wide, framed in timber and sided with cedar clapboards, darkened almost black by weather. A portion of the roof sagged where rafters had failed, exposing gray sheathing beneath curled asphalt shingles. The chimney rose from the south wall with a visible lean. Over the entrance hung a wooden sign so faded that only fragments of gold lettering remained. Mercer Weather Case Works. The surname was unmistakable. She stood beneath it until rain began collecting on the shoulders of her coat. The front door opened only after she lifted it by the iron latch and pushed with her hip. It dragged across the floorboards with a long wooden complaint. Cold air came outward carrying old ash mildew dried glue and something sweeter beneath them. Walnut. Sylvie stepped inside. The front room held 2 workbenches beneath tall windows, 3 of them missing panes. Wind moved through the openings and stirred a curtain of cobwebs near the ceiling. Her shoes ground over plaster grit. Somewhere inside a drop of water struck metal at steady intervals. She ran one hand along the nearest bench. The surface was scarred with crescent cuts and square holes from bench dogs. A dried ribbon of animal glue clung to one corner like amber. When she rubbed it with her thumb, it released the faint smell Jonah's shed had carried on winter mornings. The back room was darker. A collapsed bending furnace occupied one wall, its brick mouth ringed with green mold and horn glue residue. Walnut blanks leaned in a rack beside it, several split end to end after decades of uncontrolled humidity. Tarnished, edge-bending straps hung from square nails. Near the center stood a massive beveling machine, its iron frame rusted but upright, the sliding bed frozen beneath a layer of dust. Sylvie approached it slowly. A long shaving tool rested in brackets above the machine. Its blade was nearly black, broad enough to work the curved outer edges of a large, banjo-style barometer case. 2 handles projected from either side. One was ordinary walnut. The other was ebony bound with a tarnished brass collar. Sylvie reached toward it, then stopped. The light was already failing. Whatever needed understanding could wait until she had survived the first night. She returned to the front room, swept one corner with a broken hand broom, and laid flattened cardboard over the driest floorboards. Her coat became a blanket. Jonah's cap became a pillow again. Darkness gathered early beneath the damaged roof. Through the broken windows, she heard wind crossing the walnut branches, the neighbor's dog barking once in the distance, and then the small sounds an abandoned building makes after no one has listened to it for a long time. Timbers settling glass, ticking in a sash. A loose strip of metal tapping somewhere above the chimney. Sylvie lay awake with the deed beneath her satchel. She owned a leaking roof, a condemned chimney, an uncertain well, several broken windows, and almost nothing with which to repair any of them. Yet, for the first night in 6 weeks, no driver could order her off a bus. No custodian needed to pretend not to see her, and no locked door stood between her and morning. In the suffocating pressure of the storm, a case carved from the most patient pain could still protect the instrument that knew clearer weather was coming. The first thing Sylvie learned was that the well worked only if she primed the pump with nearly a quart of water. The second was that the outhouse door had swollen into its frame and needed to be lifted by the lower hinge before it would close. By the third morning, she had memorized the floor. 2 boards beside the front bench groaned under a heel. One near the stove clicked but held. 3 in the back room bowed enough that she marked them with chalk from an old carpenter's pouch and stepped around them. The shop was beginning to tell her where its weight remained trustworthy. She carried water from the well in an enamel pail she found behind the bending furnace, strained it through clean cloth, and boiled what she intended to drink. The first 2 days she ate bread from Doris Bell's cafe and an apple left anonymously on the doorstep. On the 3rd morning, she walked into town with a list written on the reverse of an old county notice. Harrow's Hardware smelled of linseed oil, rope, galvanized metal, and the dry mineral dust of sacks stacked too long beneath wooden shelves. The man behind the counter had one eyebrow permanently divided by a narrow white scar. His name, painted on his apron in fading red thread, was Warren Harrow. He read Sylvie's list without comment. "Brush rods," he said, "for the chimney. Have you ever swept one? No. Then you have not yet decided whether you need rods." Sylvie waited. Warren folded the paper once and pointed toward the rear aisle. He showed her a 6-inch wire chimney brush for $8.75. 3 fiberglass rods at $2.40 each, a gallon of masonry cleaner for $5.60, a box of heavy work gloves for $3.25, and a 25-pound sack of patching mortar for $6.90. A small folding pruning saw cost $4.50, but Sylvie put it back after counting the money she did not have. "I cannot buy any of this today." "I know." She looked at him. Warren pulled an account ledger from beneath the register. Name, Sylvie Mercer. The pencil stopped. He lifted his eyes only once. "Shop Road." "Yes." He turned the ledger toward himself and wrote carefully. "What can you pay?" "Eventually." Eventually is a useful word in this town. Sylvie considered the figure. $5 a week once I find work. 3. She shook her head. I can do 5. Warren gave the smallest possible shrug. Then 5. He opened the drawer below the counter and removed a grease-stained paperback titled Home Repair for Old New England Houses. This one is free. I can bring it back. No, somebody already did. She walked home, carrying less than $20 worth of supplies on credit and the repair manual beneath her coat to protect it from rain. The chimney came first because every cold night made the decision for her. Sylvie spent an hour reading the section on flues and another examining the fireplace throat with a cracked shaving mirror tied to a stick. Creosote had accumulated along the upper flue in brittle black scales. She covered the hearth with an old canvas drop cloth, removed the warped iron damper, and climbed onto the south roof only after testing each ladder rung twice. The brick felt colder than the air. She fed the 6-inch brush downward 1 rod at a time, turning clockwise as Warren's manual instructed so the threaded couplings would not loosen inside the flue. The first passes produced almost nothing. Then a section broke free above the smoke shelf, and a black fall of soot struck the canvas below, hard enough to sound like sand poured onto paper. She worked for 4 hours, descended, vacuumed nothing, because she owned no vacuum, and instead lifted the soot carefully with a fireplace shovel into an old grain sack. The next morning she did it again. This time she tied a length of rope to the brush and worked from both directions, scraping the upper bend until the bristles emerged with only a gray dusting. She examined the chimney inside and out before lighting anything. 2 bricks near the shoulder were spalled but stable. The mortar joints above the roof needed attention. The lean was real, though less alarming when measured against a plumb line than it had looked from the road. She wrote the defects in Jonah's old habit not as fear but as work. At dusk, she arranged 3 pieces of dry walnut scrap over twisted paper, opened the damper fully, and struck 1 match. The flame climbed reluctantly. Then the draft caught. Smoke pulled straight upward. Sylvie sat on the floor with both hands extended toward the first fire the shop had held in years. In the enamel pail she heated water, added 2 potatoes Warren had placed in her bag without mentioning them, a pinch of salt from a paper packet, and half an onion Doris had given her. The meal tasted mostly of smoke. It was hot. She ate every spoonful. The workroom became easier to examine once warmth had taken the wet edge from the air. Sylvie moved slowly because old shops punished haste. On the north wall hung a brass trammel compass stiff with verdigris. Beneath it lay 2 curved walnut templates, each shaped like the swollen lower body of a banjo barometer case. A drawer contained 5 carving gouges wrapped in oil-darkened cloth. A heavy shooting plane rested beneath the rear bench, its irons still protected by wax. Near the bending furnace stood a stack of narrow brass edging strips, green at the corners, but unbroken. A wooden rack held 2 intact mercury tube cradles lined with faded felt. On the highest shelf she found a paper pattern for an acanthus crest pricked with hundreds of tiny transfer holes. The beveling shave remained above the machine. Sylvie took it down on the 4th afternoon. It was heavier than she expected. The broad iron blade measured nearly 14 inches from end to end, shaped more like a cooper's draw knife than any modern cabinet tool. One handle was walnut worn smooth where a thumb had rested thousands of times. The other was ebony with 2 narrow brass bands and a rounded end cap. She turned it in her hands. The balance was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just enough. Jonah had once taught her to test a plane by laying 1 finger beneath its center of gravity. A tool built symmetrically should reveal itself without argument. This one tipped toward the ebony handle. Sylvie set it on the bench. She tapped the walnut handle with the wooden butt of a chisel. A clean, hard note. She tapped the ebony. Duller. Again. Walnut sharp. Ebony low. She looked closely at the brass collar. A line ran around its circumference, so narrow it could have been decoration. Near the underside, hidden beneath a skin of blackened wax and dust, were 2 recessed screw heads no wider than grains of rice. She cleaned them with the point of a sewing needle. The screws turned reluctantly. When the collar loosened, the ebony grip did not slide away. Sylvie pulled. Nothing. She warmed the handle beside the stove for 10 minutes, wrapped it in cloth, and tried again. Still nothing. The end cap drew her attention next. At first it appeared solid. Under stronger light she saw that the center was a separate disc slightly lighter than the surrounding ebony. Cedar. A disc of red cedar had been fitted into the end, darkened with stain until it nearly disappeared. She pressed it. No movement. She tapped it with a thumbnail. Hollow. Sylvie sat down. The fire cracked behind her. For several minutes, she did nothing except look at the tool. Then she went to the drawer of carving gouges and chose the narrowest. She did not pry. Instead, she traced the cedar's edge, shaving away hardened wax one grain at a time until a hairline seam appeared. A small brass pin sat inside the seam. She pressed it with the gouge. The cedar disc released by less than 1/8 of an inch. Sylvie pulled it free. Inside the ebony handle was darkness. She tipped the tool downward over the bench. Nothing fell. She found a narrow wooden dowel, inserted it carefully, and felt resistance about 4 inches inside. Whatever occupied the cavity was wrapped tightly enough to grip the walls. She hooked the end with a bent piece of brass wire. The first package emerged slowly. Oilcloth. Brown, stiff-tied with linen thread. Sylvie placed it on the bench without opening it. The second bundle was narrower and wrapped in waxed paper. Then came a short tin cylinder. Then a folded strip of leather. Finally, the cavity gave up a small rectangular tin box no larger than a tobacco case. Sylvie set all 5 objects in a row. The room had become entirely quiet around them. She opened the leather roll first. Inside lay 3 miniature carving tools, a vaner, a shallow gouge, and a tiny skew chisel. Their hornbeam handles had darkened with age, but the cutting edges remained polished beneath a film of oil. The waxed paper bundle held 6 strips of gold leaf between tissue nearly weightless. The tin cylinder unscrewed after a careful application of lamp oil to the threads. Inside, cushioned with wool, was a barometer tube no longer than Sylvie's hand. It was not brass. The metal had the dense, unmistakable color of gold. Tiny engraved marks ran along one side, and on the cap were the initials E.M. Sylvie placed it down more carefully than anything else. The oilcloth package contained a stitched notebook. Its cover had been rubbed nearly smooth. Every page was filled in compact handwriting with drying temperatures, grain orientations, moisture notes, glue ratios, and sketches of curved cases. One passage described seasoning black walnut in stepped heat so the wood could survive salt-laden sea air without twisting around a fragile mercury tube. Sylvie did not read further. The tin box remained. Its lid resisted at first. She worked a pocket knife around the edge until the old gasket released with a soft breath. Inside were paper-wrapped rolls and envelopes stacked so precisely they seemed packed yesterday. The first envelope contained currency, old bills. The next held more. Beneath them were coins arranged in small cloth sleeves. Morgan silver dollars. Barber half-dollars, Indian head cents, and several Liberty head gold pieces whose weight surprised her. Sylvie counted once, then again. Then a third time with totals written on brown wrapping paper because she no longer trusted her head. The cash and coin values according to the handwritten inventory enclosed beneath them came to $38,500. 38,552. She stared at the figure. It exceeded every sum she had ever held, saved, lost, or imagined having available at once. At the bottom of the box lay one additional object wrapped separately in cotton. A military medal. The ribbon had faded almost gray-blue. The bronze showed a profile in lettering worn smooth at the highest points. A folded note beneath it named Private Thomas Mercer and carried the year 1918. Sylvie did not know enough to identify the decoration with certainty. She put it back exactly as she had found it. Under the medal lay one cream envelope. No address. No stamp. Only a line written by hand. For the one who finds the handle hollow. Sylvie knew the handwriting before she allowed herself to admit it. The deliberate downward stroke of the M. The open top on the number 4. Jonah. She sat with the letter between both hands. The stove gave a small metallic tick as it cooled. Outside evening had cleared after 3 days of rain. Sylvie could have opened the envelope. Instead, she returned the money to its wrappers, placed the gold tube beside the notebook, and carried the unopened letter outside. The land behind the shop fell toward a narrow, marshy channel feeding the reservoir. She walked until the roof disappeared behind walnut trunks and sat on a granite outcrop above the water. The sky had turned pale violet over the trees. A muskrat crossed the channel, leaving a V-shaped wake that widened until it reached both banks. Sylvie held Jonah's letter in her lap without breaking the seal. She had spent years receiving explanations only after the damage was complete. She had learned what it meant for someone else to decide when she was ready to know the truth. This time, the choice belonged to her. She stayed beside the water until the first star appeared and the envelope had cooled beneath her hands. In the suffocating pressure of the storm, a case carved from the most patient pain could still protect the instrument that knew clearer weather was coming. Morning came pale and windless. Sylvie carried the envelope back to the workbench and set it beside Jonah's wool cap. In daylight, there was no mistaking the hand. The capital J curled inward exactly as it had on birthday cards. The lowercase r ended abruptly, as though Jonah always expected the next word to begin before the last one was finished. She broke the seal with the thin blade of the miniature skew chisel. Inside were 4 folded sheets. The first line read, "My dear one, whoever you are. If you are reading this, then you found the hollow handle. And if you found the hollow handle, you did not come here by accident of greed. A greedy person would have torn the shop apart. You listen to the tool first. I am writing in Waltham, Massachusetts, after Dr. Samuel Keene at Massachusetts General Hospital told me that the cancer in my pancreas had spread to my liver. He believes I have months, perhaps less. I have no complaint against him for saying it plainly. A measurement is only useful when it is honest. The shop began with Elias Mercer, born in Lowell in 1841, who apprenticed to a cabinet maker before opening Mercer Weather Case Works here in 1888. His daughter, Miriam Mercer, born in 1878, learned the carving bench and kept the patterns after Elias died in 1909. Miriam's son, Benjamin Mercer, born in 1901 in Concord, carried the work through the Depression and taught my father, Arthur Mercer, born in 1924. Arthur taught me. I was born Jonah Mercer in 1946, the 4th generation to inherit the knowledge and the first to inherit it without the building. The trade closed on October 6, 1947. After that date, the shop stood silent for more than 30 years before anyone in our branch of the family entered it again. The silence began with loss. Miriam's younger brother Thomas enlisted during the First World War and died in France in 1918. The metal in the box was returned to the family with his effects. No one displayed it. Miriam wrapped it and put it away because some griefs are not improved by being placed where visitors can comment on them. If you mean to use the notebook, do not trust every old number without testing the wood in front of you. For black walnut intended for a deep banjo case, bring the moisture down slowly and never force it below 7%. Warm a bending blank at approximately 150 degrees Fahrenheit before asking it to take the tighter lower curve. For the old hide glue, 3 parts dry glue to 5 parts water by weight will give you a workable body after soaking overnight. Keep it near 140 degrees, never boiling. When setting a mercury tube cradle, allow at least 1/16 of an inch relief where metal, glass, and timber meet, because each moves differently when the room changes temperature. Gold leaf wants breath, not pressure. Lay it after the size has gone from wet shine to a quiet tack. The money is not wages owed to you, and it is not a prize. It is stored labor. That distinction matters. Each bill came from work somebody performed and chose not to spend. Each coin represents an hour, a winter, a commission delivered, a roof repaired, instead of replaced, a meal cooked at home instead of purchased. Use it only where work can continue because of it. If you spend none of it, that is acceptable. If you spend some to make the building safe, that is also acceptable. What you must not do is let money become the master of the thing it was meant to preserve. There is something else behind the shop. Walk out the rear door and face the reservoir. 12 paces from the threshold stands the oldest walnut tree. On its eastern side, low beneath the moss, you will find a small cut mark shaped like a barometer, case-round belly, narrow throat-pointed crest. Do not dig there. The mark matters, but not yet. When the house is dry, the chimney safe and the windows closed against winter look again. I came back to this place in 1998, 2004, and 2011. Each time I believed I would find a way to buy it, repair it, and bring you here. I never managed the first part, and I did not tell you because I refused to make a promise out of a property I did not own. But I did leave the handle. I left the notebook. I left the money. And I left enough work unfinished for someone patient to decide whether it deserved another century. Inheritance is not possession. It is the moment one worker places a tool down and another decides whether to pick it up carefully. If you are my Sylvie, I am sorry I did not live long enough to put the key in your hand myself. If you are someone I never knew, then you have my trust anyway. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Jonah, Arthur Mercer, November 19, Sylvie read the final line once. Then she went back to the beginning. The second reading took longer. She stopped twice, not because the words blurred, but because her hands had begun to shake and she did not want the paper damaged. When she finished, she folded each sheet along the original creases, pressing the edges with the flat of her palm exactly where Jonah had pressed them 13 years earlier. The envelope went beneath the notebook. Then she opened the rear door. 12 paces. She counted slowly. The oldest walnut tree stood wider than the others, its trunk divided 8 feet above the ground. Moss covered the eastern side in a thick green seam. Sylvie knelt. At first she found nothing. Then she brushed the moss downward with the edge of her hand. A carving emerged from the bark. A circle. Above it a narrow neck. At the top 3 shallow cuts forming a pointed crest. A barometer case. The mark was weathered, almost smooth, but still deliberate. She put her fingers over it. The bark was cool and damp. She did not dig. Back inside, the small gold barometer tube waited beside the open notebook. Sylvie cleaned one glass lamp she had found on the shelf, trimmed the hardened wick, and filled it with a little kerosene Warren had added to her account. She struck a match and lowered the chimney. Light gathered slowly across the workbench. The gold tube caught it first. A narrow band of warm reflection traveled along the engraved scale and rested against the initials E.M. For a while, Sylvie stood without moving. That afternoon, Warren arrived carrying a paper sack of stove bolts she had not ordered. "You will need them later," he said. He left before she could ask what they cost. Doris Bell walked up the lane at 5 with 2 thick slices of brown bread wrapped in wax paper and a jar of bean soup. "Jar comes back," she said. The soup, the jar. Mrs. Vale sent no message, but when Sylvie visited the clerk's office the next morning, a photocopy of the 1888 parcel map had already been folded beside the counter, with Mercer written across the top. The elderly neighbor with the loose red suspender appeared near sunset, carrying a bundle of dry maple split to stove length. His black and white dog came with him. "Storm tomorrow." Sylvie looked at the wood. "I cannot pay you. I did not ask." He stacked it beneath the eave and left. 4 small things. No speeches. No promises. No one asked Sylvie to earn them before accepting them. Before we go further, think about one small kindness someone once gave you when you had very little to offer back. Maybe it was a meal, a ride, a warm room, or simply someone choosing not to look away. If you remember one, tell us about it in the comments. Sometimes the smallest kindness is the part a person carries longest. That night, the wind arrived from the northeast. Sylvie checked the chimney twice, latched the front door, and moved the tin box away from a known roof leak. She wrapped the 3 miniature carving tools in their original leather and placed them beside her bedding. The notebook rested beneath Jonah's cap. The gold tube lay inside its wool-lined cylinder, and the letter refolded along its old creases stayed close enough that she could reach it in the dark. The first snow came on December 2nd and measured 7 inches against the stone step by noon. By then, Sylvie had spent weeks doing paid cleaning at Doris Bell's cafe before opening and stocking shelves at Harrow's Hardware after closing. She had also read the roofing chapter of Warren's repair manual 3 times, once at the workbench, once beside the stove, and once standing beneath the damaged rafters with a pencil behind her ear. The roof measured roughly 38 by 24 feet with 2 slopes and enough waste around the failed north section to require 24 bundles of asphalt shingles, 2 rolls of 15-pound felt, and nearly 30 pounds of galvanized roofing nails. Sylvie wrote every figure twice before ordering. Warren delivered the materials in his pickup. Beneath the felt rolls lay an old roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle and a square pole worn bright at one corner. "That was my brother's," he said. "I cannot take it. Hi has been dead 9 years. He is not using it." The following morning, the neighbor with the red suspender arrived before Sylvie had finished carrying the first ladder outside. His name was Walter Ames. He had roofed houses for 37 years before his knees forced him down from ladders. "I cannot pay you," Sylvie said. Walter tested a rung with his boot. Good. That ended the discussion. They worked 11 days. The failed rafter had to be sistered first. Walter showed Sylvie how to jack the sag, slowly raising it less than a quarter inch at a time, before fastening a straight new member alongside the old. They replaced rotten sheathing only where a screwdriver entered without resistance, rolled, felt from the eave upward, and snapped chalk lines so the shingle courses would not wander toward the ridge. Walter taught her to start each roofing nail with one tap, seat it with the second, and finish it flush with the third. On the fourth day, he pointed with the hatchet. "That nail's proud." Sylvie looked. "Pull it." She did. By the 9th day, her shoulders hurt before breakfast. By the 10th, sleet froze along the ladder rails. On the 11th, December 14th, Sylvie drove the final ridge nail while Walter stood below with one hand resting on the ladder. That night, snow fell again. She placed 3 empty jars under the places that had leaked most badly before. By morning, all 3 were dry. January exposed everything the first repairs had only postponed. The chimney bricks above the roof line were spalling badly, now their faces separating into thin shells after years of freeze and thaw. Mortar between several courses could be brushed into powder with 2 fingers. Sylvie refused to coat it with modern cement after Walter warned that hard Portland mortar could trap moisture and damage the old brick further. She mixed hydraulic lime mortar in small batches and reserved a fireclay mixture for the hottest interior joints, using roughly 3 parts sand to 1 part hydraulic lime outside and a tighter fireclay-rich repair where the flue met the smoke chamber. For 3 weeks she worked whenever the weather rose above freezing. Most afternoons stayed in the 20s. Gloves made the narrow joints clumsy, so she removed them for the final pointing. Her bare fingers went numb in 15 minutes. She would descend, warm them against a mug beside the stove until sensation returned painfully, then climb again. Walter helped brace the leaning stack while Sylvie removed only the unsound courses. They reset the brick rather than replacing what could be saved, tooled each joint after the mortar began to firm, and covered fresh work at night beneath a canvas and moving blankets to slow the freeze. The chimney did not become straight. It became sound. On a January 27, Sylvie laid a small test fire beneath the repaired flue. First paper, then kindling, then 1 split of maple. She walked outside and watched the chimney cap. A pale column of smoke rose cleanly into the winter air. No smoke entered the room. No joint hissed. Walter looked upward for a long while. "That will do." Sylvie stood beside him until the maple caught fully and heat reached the bricks from within. The floor waited beneath decades of dirt, glue, soot, and boot wear. Most of the boards were white pine wide enough to have come from trees already old when Elias Mercer opened the shop. They were fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails, many sunk beneath dark circles polished by generations of shoes. Sylvie lifted only the 3 boards she had marked unsafe months earlier. Their joists were solid. She patched the damaged edges with salvaged pine, reset the original nails where they remained usable, and drove replacements only where metal had rusted through. Warren rented her a random orbit sander for $14 per day. She worked in 3 passes. 80 grit removed grime and the worst raised fibers. 120 leveled the transitions. 220 left the pine smooth enough to accept oil without erasing the shallow scars of the old benches. She vacuumed with Warren's borrowed shop vacuum, wiped the boards carefully, then applied the first thin oil coat with cotton rags. 2 more coats followed. Each cured 48 hours. The color changed slowly from dark honey toward mahogany, where old walnut dust had worked into the grain. On January 31, Sylvie woke before daylight and could not make herself pick up a tool. She put on Jonah's cap and walked behind the shop. A great blue heron stood at the edge of the marsh. 1 leg hidden beneath its body, gray feathers nearly the same color as the morning. Sylvie sat on the granite outcrop. The bird remained for more than an hour. So did she. Chassan did nothing that day. She did not visit town. She did not calculate the next repair. Near sunset, the heron opened its wings and crossed the reservoir with 3 slow strokes before disappearing behind the trees. Sylvie returned inside, added 1 split of maple to the fire, and accepted that preserving a place did not require occupying every hour with work. 8 windows remained. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes patched with tape or cardboard. The eighth contained one wavy original pane that county records suggested might date from 1788, salvaged from an earlier structure and reused when the shop was built. Sylvie would not replace it. She removed each sash onto padded trestles and numbered its parts in pencil. Old glazing points came out with a narrow putty knife warmed beside the stove. She softened brittle bedding compound gradually rather than forcing the glass. Warren showed her how to knead DAP 33 glazing putty until it became smooth and warm. Press a thin bedding layer beneath each pane. Set glazier's points without driving pressure toward the glass and draw the finishing knife in one deliberate stroke along the rebate. The sash cords were worse than the glazing. Most had rotted inside the weight pockets. Sylvie used quarter-inch cotton sash cord fetted over the pulleys, attached each counterweight with a compact figure-8 knot, and tested every sash before replacing the trim. The original pane received no machine cleaning, only warm water, a cotton cloth. Time. By February 8, 7 windows opened and closed without binding. Sylvie set the final sash on the front wall just after noon. As she tied the last counterweight, a chickadee landed on a bare walnut branch outside. The bird turned its black-capped head toward the glass. Sylvie raised the sash 6 inches. Cold air entered cleanly through the opening. The chickadee remained on the branch. She lowered the sash again. For the first time since she had arrived, every window between the shop and the Massachusetts winter contained glass. The walls came last because they had waited longest. Behind broken sections of plaster, Sylvie found hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven enough to show where a hatchet had followed the grain. Much of the original horsehair plaster still held. She left it alone. Near the chimney, however, 3 patches failed in 3 days. The first slumped before setting. The second cracked overnight. The third released from the lath in one whole piece and landed on the floor with a dull clap. Sylvie stared at it, then swept it up. Warren appeared that afternoon carrying an old cloth bag. My father kept this. Inside was clean horsehair bundled and dry. Sylvie mixed lime plaster in smaller batches, teasing the hair through it rather than allowing clumps. A scratch coat went on first, pressed firmly through the oak lath and scored while green. The brown coat followed at roughly 3/8 of an inch and cured 72 hours beneath damp burlap. The finish coat was barely 1/8 inch, smooth enough to catch light without pretending the wall had been built yesterday. When the last patch had dried, Sylvie pressed 2 fingers against it. Solid. These patches will hold another 100 years. She said it quietly, not as prediction but instruction. By then, the lane had become part of other people's routes. Doris Bell came most often before sunrise, recognizable at a distance by the red scarf she wore knotted over gray hair. She never knocked. Paper bags simply appeared beside the front step heel ends of rye bread biscuits that had baked too dark for the cafe counter, sometimes a bowl of stew wrapped in a dish towel. When Sylvie finally caught her placing one down, she held out $2. Doris closed Sylvie's fingers over the money. Pay me in candles when the shop reopens. Then she walked away before the sentence could become a bargain. Caleb Ames arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul balanced awkwardly across the handlebars. He was Walter's grandson, 16 tall enough that his wrists showed beyond the sleeves of his coat. He spent 2 hours reducing maple rounds into stove wood with an accuracy that made conversation unnecessary. Sylvie offered him cash. He shook his head. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all. He stacked the last split with the bark outward, mounted the bicycle, and coasted down the lane with the maul tied across the rear rack. Reverend Boyd passed each morning shortly after 7. He was a broad man with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of carrying leather gloves even when his hands were bare. He never tried to bring Sylvie to church. He tipped his hat. Sometimes he helped lift a board, hold a ladder, or carry a coal scuttle without asking whether the task needed religion attached to it. On the coldest February morning he paused beside the restored window, bowed his head only slightly, and said 4 words. "Keep her roof standing." Then he continued toward town. Sylvie watched him disappear between the walnut trees. The shop had once been isolated by abandonment. Now solitude and loneliness were no longer the same thing. Sylvie postponed the cellar until February 11. The entrance lay beneath a trapdoor behind the rear bench. 7 granite steps descended into a room 12 feet by 15, walled and floored in fieldstone. The air smelled of minerals, cold earth, and old apples, though no orchard stood nearby. At the center of the floor lay a dressed granite slab, unlike the irregular stones around it. Its surface carried the same craft mark cut into the walnut tree, round, belly-narrow, throat-pointed crest. Sylvie swept the slab carefully. She did not lift it. Jonah had told her to wait, and she had learned that waiting could be a form of work. On the way back up, her boot struck something beneath the third step. She knelt. A small oak box had been wedged deep into the shadow beneath the granite tread. Its lid opened on wooden pins. Inside rested a brass key. The bow was shaped like a banjo barometer case. Beneath it lay one tintype wrapped in linen. The photograph showed the shop in the summer of 1903. Its siding lighter windows open, walnut leaves full behind it. A young woman stood before the door holding a beveling shave across both hands. Her face stopped Sylvie. The brow, the straight mouth, the slight asymmetry at the left eye. It was not Sylvie's face exactly. It was close enough to make her sit on the step. On the back, written in brown ink, were the words, "Miriam Mercer, daughter of Elias, age 25, summer of 1903. Sylvie carried the photograph upstairs. The brass key remained on the mantel afterward, hanging from a square nail beside Jonah's letter. She tried it in no lock. She did not know what it opened. For once, not knowing did not make her hurry. Snow retreated from the southern side of the shop first. By March, the creek below the reservoir ran loud enough to be heard through the closed windows, and in April, the walnut branches developed long green catkins that moved in every wind. Sylvie had enough shelter now to begin learning what the building had been built for. She chose not to. Not yet. The full craft could wait. She spent 1 coin from the cash on practice materials and recorded the expense in Jonah's notebook. Small walnut samples came first. She cut shallow housings, tested hide glue, practiced the lower banjo curve, and ruined several pieces without pretending they were anything else. One successful bevel was enough for an afternoon. One clean acanthus leaf was enough for a week. The gold tube stayed wrapped. The old templates remained hanging where generations of hands had left them. Sylvie was no longer trying to prove she deserved the building. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sylvie completed her first full barometer case. She began with a black walnut board seasoned to 8% moisture and rejected 2 sections before choosing one whose grain followed the long axis cleanly. The lower body took 3 bending attempts. The acanthus crest took 11 evenings. She cut the mercury cradle relief by hand, leaving 1/16 of an inch where Jonah's notebook required movement, and laid the final narrow strip of gold after the size lost its wet shine. There was no instrument inside it yet, only the case. Sylvie hung it above the original front bench and stepped backward until the proportions settled into view. The shop around it had changed without becoming new. The white pine floor still showed dark islands where benches had stood for generations, the 1788 window bent. Winter light slightly at its center. The chimney leaned just enough to reveal its age while drying cleanly. Repaired plaster met original plaster without disguise. Warren's brother's roofing hatchet hung beside the door, and Jonah's wool cap remained on a peg above the workbench. Nothing matched perfectly. Everything held. The brass key had spent nearly 2 years on the mantel before Sylvie noticed the plate in the walnut tree. It appeared during a December thaw when a section of old bark released from the eastern side. Beneath it was a narrow brass rectangle set flush into the trunk, green with oxidation, with a keyway at its center. Sylvie brought the key outside. It turned once. A small wooden plug inside the hollow released. The cavity was no larger than a bread box and had been lined with sheet copper. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag, protected by waxed cloth and a small envelope addressed in Miriam Mercer's hand. The letter was dated October 12, 1918. Miriam wrote during the final weeks of the First World War, after news had reached Massachusetts that her brother Thomas had died in France. She wrote that the flag had belonged to him before enlistment, folded on his workbench during the months he trained away from home. If he returned, she intended to give it back. If he did not, she wanted it kept where weather and strangers could not turn it into decoration. She wrote only 6 lines about grief. Most of the letter concerned work. Elias had taught them both that a case existed to protect something more fragile than itself. Tom had laughed and said a soldier's coat served much the same purpose. Miriam ended by asking whoever found the flag not to display it permanently. Air it on a clear day, she wrote, then fold it and keep it working. Sylvie carried the flag inside. On November 11, 2025, she took Thomas Mercer's medal and the folded flag to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. There was no ceremony. Walter drove because the weather forecast called for sleet. Doris sent coffee in a thermos. Sylvie found the family marker beneath bare oaks and set the medal at its base while she cleaned leaves from the carved name. Thomas Mercer. She remained until 11. Then she wrapped the medal again and brought it home. The dead did not need metal left in rain to know they had been remembered. The money required a slower decision. Sylvie had used 4 coins. 1 paid for practice walnut and hide glue. 1 paid toward roofing materials. 1 covered specialized glass for a restored sash. 1 purchased a second-hand moisture meter after Warren refused to let her borrow his indefinitely. Everything else remained. She moved the currency and coins from the tobacco tin into a fire-resistant steel box bolted beneath the old rear bench, but she kept the original wrapper's inventory and linen ties. On top, she placed an envelope. The next one. Inside, she wrote the amount, the 4 expenditures, and the reason for each. Then she closed the box. The shop did not reopen with an announcement. There was no website launch ribbon cutting or newspaper story. Sylvie made 1 index card. Hand-carved wooden weather instrument cases. Repairs accepted when appropriate. Mercer Weather Case Works, Old Sudbury Road. Doris pinned it to the cafe corkboard between a snowplow advertisement and a notice for piano lessons. The first inquiry came 4 days later. The second came from someone who had seen the first customer's restored wall barometer. A spring Sylvie kept a mailing list in a school notebook. 43 names. She never promised delivery dates she could not meet. Some months she completed 1 case. Some months none. When a customer brought a damaged 19th century case whose mercury tube had survived but whose walnut frame had split at the lower curve, Sylvie spent 3 days examining it before saying yes. She charged for the repair. She wrote the amount in the ledger. Work was allowed to support work. Caleb returned one April afternoon taller, his bicycle replaced by an old pickup with rust over both rear wheel wells. A long object wrapped in a moving blanket extended from the bed. He refused Sylvie's help unloading it. Together, they leaned it against the shop wall and removed the blanket. The sign was walnut. Not new walnut from a lumber yard, but dark reclaimed boards from a storm-damaged barn Walter had helped dismantle. Caleb had carved the original wording in restrained serif letters, Mercer Weather Case Works. Below it, smaller, and daughters. Sylvie looked at him. There have not been daughters here in years. Caleb wiped carving dust from one sleeve. There was Miriam. Sylvie looked at the sign again. And me. He nodded. And whoever comes next. The carving around the letters was imperfect. One terminal stroke dipped slightly. The final S was narrower than the others. Sylvie ran a thumb across it. Do not fix that. I wasn't going to. They hung the sign beneath the old faded one instead of removing it. The 2 boards remained together, the first nearly erased by weather, the second carrying the addition. Years did not have to be concealed for continuity to exist. That winter Sylvie began her own letter. She used cream paper because Jonah had, not antique paper, not imitation, just good heavy stock that would fold without cracking. At the top she wrote, "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped. For 2 weeks the page remained on the bench beneath a clean block of walnut. When she returned to it, she wrote about the roof first. She explained which rafter had been sistered, which chimney courses had been reset, where the oldest pane should never be scrubbed with abrasive cleaner, and why the cellar slab should not be lifted merely because curiosity had become uncomfortable. She included the hide glue ratio, the moisture target, the location of the steel box. She wrote Warren Harrow's name, Doris Bell's, Walter Ames's, Caleb's, Eleanor Vale's, and Reverend Boyd's. Not because the next person needed their histories. Because a building never survives by timber alone. At the end of the second page she wrote that the gold barometer tube still belonged with the shop and should never be melted however high the price of gold became. Then she described the ebony handle. She did not say what would be hidden there next. That decision could wait. On the first clear morning, after finishing the letter, Sylvie opened the rear door and walked 12 paces to the oldest walnut tree. The 48-star flag had been aired the previous November and folded again. The brass key hung around her neck only for the walk. She touched Miriam's weathered craft mark. Above her bare branches moved against a hard blue sky. Inside the shop, the first completed case waited above the bench with its empty cradle prepared for an instrument. In the suffocating pressure of the storm, a case carved from the most patient pain could still protect the instrument that knew clearer weather was coming. Sylvie went back inside. She sharpened the beveling shave until the iron raised one continuous shaving from a scrap of walnut. Then she turned the shop lamp down, checked the stove, and placed her new letter beside Jonah's original. Outside the creek moved beneath a thin skin of ice. The wooden barometer case carver's shop waits. It has always waited. At the county office, Mrs. Eleanor Vale remained another year before retiring. On her final afternoon, she emptied the walnut desk drawer, where deed receipts, spare pencils, and forgotten paper clips had collected for decades. At the back lay a softened $5 bill. She recognized it, rather than put it in the cash drawer. Eleanor folded the bill once and slipped it beneath the old Mercer property card. The next clerk would probably never understand why. That was all right. Some things survive because someone knows their value. Others survive because someone chooses not to spend them.